everyone, this is China Paradigm, where we, Dashi Consulting, interview seasoned entrepreneurs in China. Hello everyone, I'm Matthieu David, the founder of Dashi Consulting and his podcast China Paradigm, and today I am with another podcaster and the editor-in-chief of TechNode, John Artman. You have been in China for 12 years now, and you have been with TechNode for more than 3 years. You will correct me if I'm wrong about the timing, but that's what I got from your LinkedIn. And you are also managing 2 podcasts, at least 2. Maybe there is one you have hidden, and I don't know. But the 2 are China Tech Talk and China Tech Investor. And I'm a listener of them. I think it's a great resource. And I like to talk about those two activities you have, being editor-in-chief of TechNode and covering China Tech through TechNode, but also through the podcast. So thanks for being with us today. And my first question is going to be a question you ask to every person. What's your China story?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a long one. I moved to China in 2008. Previously, I had visited here twice, so once in 2004 and once in 2006 with my university. So I started studying Chinese in 2003 with my I went to a small public university in North Carolina called Appalachian State, and we had a very small Chinese department. But I was very lucky to have a great Chinese teacher who was visiting from Suzhou University. She gave me my Chinese name and really inspired me to keep studying. So anyway, I graduated in 2006 with a degree in psychology and philosophy, and a minor in Chinese language. And then I worked for about 9 to 10 months at a mental health facility for children, which was very, very stressful. And then
in China?
No, in the US, near my university. And then didn't know what I wanted to do. Just kind of like, well, I guess I just got to figure something else out. So a bunch of my friends had moved to Nashville, Tennessee. They were artists and musicians and writers, and so I was planning on moving there as well. But then before I actually moved, I had Christmas with my father's side of the family, and my uncle used to live in Beijing, and he was like, John, you could go and mess around with your friends whenever you want, or you can go to China. I mean, you already have the language skills. You can go to China and you can ride the wave. And I was like, that's a really good idea. So he put me in touch with an English teaching school, like a private training center for adults. I was able to get a job there. Came to China in 2008, March 2008. And, I had a 1-year contract teaching English, and that was basically going to be it. Just kind of come here, teach English for a year, and then, and probably come back and do something else. But it ended up, I met my now wife. We dated for a while. We have 2 kids now, and I ended up working at China Radio International for about 5.5 years. Started off doing research and guest booking. Then I worked in pre-recorded weekend show, lifestyle, kind of silly stuff mostly. But then the last couple of years that I was there, I was very fortunate to help design and host a program called Roundtable. And if you listen to China Radio International, 91 Easy FM is the name of the station. In Beijing, it's 91.5. That show is actually still going. More than 4 years after I've left, that show is still going. It's a very popular format. But basically, it was a 1-hour show where we discussed Chinese social issues, and so we used mostly Weibo as well as other kind of public forums for inspiration, looking at news and things like that. And funny enough, TechNode, both for that show as well for some technology reporting that I was doing, was actually a pretty big resource for understanding what was happening. But yeah, so I was there for about 5.5 years, kind of reached the bamboo ceiling, as it were. There's not enough, wasn't really, I mean, it's a state-run media, so there's not much room for a foreigner to grow. And also this was a few years after, the present leadership, gained power. And so everything was becoming a bit more, politically correct, if you want to think of it that way. And so I worked in localization for a year and a half, mostly servicing Huawei and their translation services centers. So I helped to build a team of English native writers and editors to help Huawei with their technical documentation. And then I saw that TechNode, so this was maybe early 2016, I saw that TechNode was looking for a managing editor. I had been out of tech and media for, 2 years at that point. And, I was really kind of missing it, being part of a public discussion, having impact, helping people understand certain issues, I think was really important for me. And so I applied. My now boss and CEO, Lu Gang, he and I had conversations over the next few months, trying to feel each other out, get a sense of kind of what we wanted and where what the organization needed. And so then I joined in November 2016. And then when I joined, we had there was me and there was 2 other reporters. And now, fast forward to almost the end of 2019, we're 15 writers and editors. We launched a membership program called TechNode Squared in May earlier this year. We've got about 250 members right now, and we're just kind of building up momentum and pushing forward. Really focusing on unbiased, factual reporting about technology in China, and then also offering analysis and insights into what's happening on the ground.
How do you organize the editorial line of TechNode as an editor-in-chief? I feel for tech, there's a lot of hot news, breaking news. So I feel it's all the more difficult actually to have an editorial line. So how do you combine those two aspects of getting a lot of breaking news, some companies raise money, some changes in technology, and so on, and on the other hand to have an editorial line?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that. First of all, we have a very strong team of editors. So we have a news editor, we have our senior editor who does a lot of different things, and then we have our commentary editor. And so we have specific people in kind of management and editing roles to make sure that things are getting done in kind of the way that we want them to. But at the end of the day, like on a day-to-day basis, one of our reporters is very busy. So they're responsible for not only covering news, but then also making sure that they're working on their feature stories. And then, we have 3 different newsletters right now as well. So we're all quite busy, I would say. But at the end of the day, it's really all about passion. So we're a team of, I would say 60% local, 40% international. And, we're all just very passionate about what we do. And I think that especially TechNode is a very unique organization where it's a media company, but it's more than a media company. And we get a lot of opportunities to talk with executives and people on the ground to really kind of figure out what's going on. And I think that's really what it's about. It's about figuring out what's going on and then writing a story to explain that to our readers.
How do you pick the topics? When I listen to your podcast, and that's another part we're going to talk about, I felt there are topics coming from time to time, more recurrent than others, like the emergence of ByteDance, for instance, as a third player compared to Tencent and Alibaba. It seems that a topic you you went into deeper than other topics. How do you pick a topic and to assess this is going to be the topic which is going to become important, the topic you want to go in depth? How do you do that in an environment where you have so many news which can actually be weak signals and change actually the environment, and on the other hand you have a lot of noise, and that's the difficulty.
So yeah, that's a very good question. I think that at the end of the day, it's really just about us, because a large part of our job is talking with people on the ground, talking with people who work for these companies, talking with people who, run their business on these companies' platforms, analysts, investors. And so I think that it's really just kind of about sounding things out. So getting a sense of what's going on, and then kind of making some guesses about, what we think is important. But also, we get a lot of signals as well from our readers as well as from our members, and so we get direct feedback from both groups. But then also, we have a very clear page view metrics, and so a lot of it's like, okay, so this story got a lot of page views, so this is something that we should follow up on. I think that one good example of that actually is our coverage of automated vehicles and electric vehicles. So we started reporting on that sector earlier this year, or taking that sector seriously earlier this year, and we just saw a lot of great feedback. People wanted more. There was a lot of demand for more interest, or for more content about this industry. And so we went whole hog. So now we have two reporters. So one reporter who covers it full time, one reporter who covers it part time. And then we have a whole newsletter dedicated to that industry. So I think I view our content like a product manager. So I'm looking at, okay, so who are our users? What do they need? And then trying to create products to fill that need. But our product is, of course, content and different kinds of content. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, I know you have a link with TechCrunch, and I know it certainly has been a source of inspiration at the opposite of sort of certainly also comparison. How do you compare with their work? How do you compare with managing a tech blog, a tech media now, a big one in the US and an influential one as well in China? How do you compare them? How different it is and how similar it is?
Yeah, so I missed part of the introduction to that question, but just to clarify, TechNode and TechCrunch are two separate companies. TechNode is the exclusive China partner of TechCrunch. We've been friends with them since 2011. We helped bring the first TechCrunch Disrupt, if I remember correctly, in 2012 to Beijing. Actually, I was working at CRI then, and I went, and that was very exciting. And we've been helping them to do TechCrunch events in China ever since then. And we also manage TechCrunch.cn, which is Chinese translations of their English content. So what's the difference? I think the one of the bigger differences is that we're a lot less bloggy, I guess, than they are. You have to remember that that both TechCrunch and TechNode have been through a lot of changes over the years. TechCrunch got started with Michael Arrington back in the early 2000s, and he's just an investor, a guy in Silicon Valley who says, there's a lot of bullshit. Excuse me my bad words, but there's a lot of nonsense going on in Silicon Valley, but no one's writing about it. I'm going to write about it, and Arrington was always very he never shied away from controversy. And so doing something like TechCrunch was a good way for him to amplify his own voice as well as agitate for change. And so journalism is activism to a certain degree. But then, TechCrunch was eventually bought by AOL. Now it's owned by Verizon. And so I think that really kind of what we're seeing is, different generations of writers. And so even TechCrunch started off as very bloggy, very personal, a lot of personal opinions. And now you have a lot of very young and intelligent writers. So they still insert some of their opinion, but at the end of the day, it is in general much more professional than it used to be. And for TechNode, we had very similar beginnings as well. Lu Gang started writing. Actually, it was called MobiNode at the time. He was in the UK getting his PhD in telecommunications engineering, and just started writing just like a personal blog about kind of whatever, a little bit of tech, and then came back to China and saw that no one was really writing about technology in China in English. So he started doing that as well, following like the kind of Michael Arrington TechCrunch model. Now, when I came on board, I had been out of media for a little while, and part of my onboarding process was kind of taking measurement of the landscape. And, you look at kind of where we are now with media and where we were then when both TechCrunch and TechNode got started. I mean, when TechNode and TechCrunch got started, like the New York Times, Bloomberg, Reuters, they didn't do a good job of having their content on the web. And at the end of the day, I mean, still like people getting content from the internet wasn't quite mainstream. So I think that like kind of looking at now, I mean, everyone's online, everyone's getting their news from everywhere. And so I was kind of looking at that and saying, okay, number one, what's our unique advantage? And how can we stay niche? I think that at the time, I think that only doing tech in China, I think it felt like it was going to be a bit of a challenge, that, there wasn't going to be that much interest, that it was too niche. But at the same time, when I was working in the radio, TechNode was an amazing resource. And so I wanted TechNode to stay as a great resource for people inside of China, outside of China, who really want to understand the country, and of course the technology. And so these days, we the way that I see it, like we are we're a type of content that's competing with all other types of content. And so it's not just, we're competing with other blogs or other websites who cover tech in China, but we're also competing with Bloomberg and Reuters in the information. And so ever since I joined, my main focus has been on, making sure that we are unique, that we are offering something that you really can't find anywhere else. And if the content is similar, well, the format's going to be different, or the level of professionalism, let's say, is going to be higher. And so that's really kind of where our commitment to neutrality comes in. It's always very disappointing to see media outlets that I respect publishing, let's say, exaggerated stories about tech in China, or maybe too simple stories is another way to put it. And so what we really strive to do is to stay neutral. We're a Chinese company. I'm an American. Like I said, our team is 40% international, 60% local. But at the end of the day, we're all committed to China in some way, shape, or form. I would say in terms of foreign staff, I mean, the shortest that any of our foreign staff has been here is maybe like 4 or 5 years. And all of our foreign staff, they've lived in China before they joined TechNode. So we're all very interested in telling the China story, but we're interested in telling it in a balanced way, because we recognize that it's a very complex country. The politics, the economics, the technology landscape is extremely complicated. And so, rather than taking a side or aiming for what we call clickbait, we want to be neutral and just give you the facts and help you understand what's actually happening. And so we've kind of evolved from kind of like the bloggy style into, I would say, something that's much more professional.
You're 15 people. this requires to finance it. What's your business model now? Recently, you have a subscription you started, but what are the different streams of revenues you have now?
Yeah, so TechNode is a lot more than just our English media. So we started off as English media, but now we do events. So for example, I was just in Shenzhen last week for the TechCrunch event down there. We do one of those every single year. We also do Asia Hardware Battle, which is, I think, pretty self-explanatory. You know, we gather hardware startups from around the Asia region, all the way to the Middle East. In fact, so the Middle East all the way to Japan in terms of geography, and then we find experts and judges to choose the best ones. So we do TechCrunch, Asia Hardware Battle. We do something called China Bang, which is like an award ceremony, kind of recognizing the best startups and the best innovation of the year. And then we also have our services teams. So we have two teams focused on financial advisory. So one team based in Singapore, which does cross-border financial advisory. So helping Indian and Southeast Asian startups get in touch with Chinese investors. And then we have a domestic financial advisory service as well that focuses on something very similar, matchmaking, basically, within the China market. So all of this is to say is that the English content isn't very well monetized. So we're very much supported by the rest of the company, and our membership as well as our annual Emerge event series is part of that monetization process. And so ever since I've joined, I mean, I'm pretty entrepreneurial, and so my one of my main goals is to make TechNode English self-sustainable. Maybe not profitable, but at least breaking even. And so our membership in our Emerge event series is a large part of that. And so right now, you go to our website and you sign up for our membership. It's $100 a year. I think we give you three newsletters, 3 in-depth newsletters. We give you access to our community as well as access to some of the reports that we produce as well. That's great value for money, and it's not always going to be 100 USD per year. And then with our Emerge events, we charge a relatively high ticket price. Compared to a lot of tech events in China, we are pretty expensive. I mean, still not like super expensive, but definitely higher than most people are used to paying. And that's for a reason, because for a lot of companies, events are a marketing tool. It's a way to raise awareness and kind of create an offline community. For us, it's definitely about the offline community, but the content is the product, and so we charge for that. So for example, in May we did panels on AI ethics in China. We did looking at China to Southeast Asia, blockchain regulation, corporate innovation, and we had some pretty big names from Walmart, from WePay, and it's been a while. My memory is failing me, but the thing is, so for the content offline, we take it very, very seriously. And we just did a side stage at TechCrunch in Shenzhen. We did cloud gaming, mass customization, so C2M, as well as China, India, and we had some really great speakers there as well. And we give time for the speakers to go in depth, and so a lot of times you'll see panels or fireside chats for maybe 15 to 20 minutes. We aim for about 45 minutes for each panel, so really kind of going in depth and making sure that we're covering the entire topic rather than just a small slice of it.
You have not mentioned advertising, which is the usual model of monetizing content. Is it because you don't monetize through advertising, or is it because it's small and you don't talk about it?
Yeah. So on the one hand, compared to TechCrunch, for example, our traffic is much lower than theirs. I mean, we're very, very niche. But at the same time, we have some really amazing SEO. We get some pretty decent engagement on social media. So our traffic is pretty good, I think, for our size. That being said, that is one of the big things that we're going to be focusing on going into 2020 is increasing traffic. So on the one hand, it is a traffic problem. I mean, like, we don't have millions and millions of people visiting us every month. But at the same time, it's also my own kind of philosophy as well. Like, I want the customer to be the end. I want the customer to be the end user. So the reader is the customer, not a sponsor. So or an ad network. Now, we do sponsored content. That's something that we've offered for quite a while. In that we do projects with companies on a regular basis. But it's not something that we really enjoy doing or really are very active in pursuing. My boss might not like me saying that. But at the end of the day, I don't like advertising. I've always been philosophically opposed to it. I think, again, the people paying for a service or a product should be the ones actually using it. And that's why we launched our membership. Because this way we have a direct link to our readers and to our fans. $100 USD, it's not a lot of money, but it is a barrier. It's a psychological barrier. And so people who choose to cross that barrier, they're doing it because they want to invest. They want to invest in the production of news and information that's relevant to them. So actually we do have an ad network on our website. It's called Carbon Ads, and so it's a very small network. They only have a very select group of advertisers that are on there, and you're not going to see random advertisements for Kim Kardashian or alien babies and things like that on our website. Instead, you'll see advertisements for things that are relevant to you. So, for example, discounts on Adobe Creative Suite, discounts on Slack memberships, and things like that. So, we're very happy with Carbon. Carbon has been really, really good for us because it's very relevant, highly targeted ads for our specific readership.
The other format you have is a podcast. You don't monetize the podcast, if I understand, because I'm not listening to any sponsor of the podcast when I listen to you. Could you share about why you started the podcast, and again, what's the difference? And I know you had actually an episode on that. What's the difference between the West and China on podcasting, or podcasting from China to the West? You had an episode where you were mentioning that podcast is very different in China than to the West, because in China it goes through platforms, Himalaya and others, which wants to monetize and sell the courses, whereas in the West it's linked to OS and it's free. Would you mind sharing a bit of the reasons why you started the podcast and the differences you see with podcasting between the West and China?
So, I've been podcasting for a long time. So I did radio, as I mentioned before, and, working at a radio station, I think, but also a state media radio station, there's a lot of kind of creativity left on the table. So my friend and I, Charlie Custer, a long time China watcher, I think he might still have his website, ChinaGeeks.com. But he and I, he's an American as well. He and I got along super well, and we both like to complain. So we started a podcast called China Punks, and it was just us kind of going through news in China and giving our own kind of young and let's say curmudgeon-y kind of opinions on stuff. We never really promoted it. It never really got huge, but it was a lot of fun to do. And so when I joined TechNode, I knew that I wanted to do a podcast. I knew that I wanted to do something in audio because audio and conversations are just fun. And I think that for me at least, I learn through writing. I learn through talking. And so ideas. Things in your head, you have them kind of swirling around, but it doesn't really kind of come out until you're actually trying to communicate them. And having people ask you questions and getting feedback, I think is extremely important for the creative process. So yeah, when I joined TechNode, I knew that I wanted to do a podcast. The talent that we had internally at the time was not quite appropriate for what I wanted to do. So I was just kind of on the lookout for an appropriate co-host. And I noticed that Matthieu Brennan was very active on WeChat, clearly was an influencer of sorts, and also really knew his stuff. And so I reached out to him and I was like, hey, I'm John, just joined TechNode. Do you want to do a podcast? And funny enough, we didn't actually meet face to face probably until about 6 months, maybe even longer than that, of doing the podcast. And I originally pitched him to do a podcast only about WeChat. And so every week we would do a podcast about what's happening with WeChat. And funny enough, he was like, no, I don't really want to do that. I don't really want to only focus on WeChat. So it's evolved really. So we do some WeChat every once in a while, but we're actually very broad when it comes to the topics that we cover. So for example, recently we looked at the social credit system. Before that was private traffic. We've done asymmetries between US and China in AI. We've covered blockchain quite extensively, although not recently. And I mean, basically anything that we find to be interesting. And then China Tech Investors, that's a friend of mine, Elliot Zagman, who also is a contributor. He is friends with James Hull, and we're just having some really great conversations. And so Elliot is kind of is a writer, and he also does some consulting. And then James is a professional investor. He used to work for I'm probably going to get this wrong. He used to work for a state-run investment company. And now he works for himself, managing money for other clients. And so, Elliot at one point pitched me, hey, let's do a podcast. James and I are having these great conversations. I want to make this a recording. And so we did. And actually just the other day, it was their 1 year anniversary. So they've been going for about 1 year. Matt and I's about 2.5 years now, I think. But your other question was, what's the difference between podcasting in the West and in China? Well, the biggest difference is that podcasting in China isn't really podcasting, or at least the way that we think about it. And so, like, podcasting in the West is very similar to talk radio, where you have, one person talking for a long time. Like Dan Carlin is a great example. Hardcore History or Common Sense. It's just one guy talking for like hours at a time. Or you have, podcasts like this one, or the one that Matt and I do, which are, one-on-one interviews, or a 3-person kind of conversation, about a topic. Whereas, podcasting in China a better way to think about it is actually it's just audio content. And so you take a lot of the content that's kind of popular, in other formats, and it's only audio. So it could be storytelling. It could be some cases discussions, but in most cases it's actually educational. So people will pay money to basically take an audio course or to gain access to an audio book or something like that. It's much less to do with talk radio. I mean, again, there are some shows that are quite popular that are very similar to talk radio, but the bulk of the content that you find on platforms like Leisure and Himalaya are in fact, more educational or storybooks or things like that. And a lot of the audio content produced by Chinese people, you're not going to find on the open web. So you're not going to find it on Spotify. You're not going to find it on Apple Podcasts, because you can't monetize on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I mean, you can have an advertiser, but advertising in the podcast space is quite difficult. And for advertisers, the metrics are still very gray, I guess you could say. I mean, because there's really no good platform that can give you 100% saying, okay, this is how many people actually listened. This is how much they actually listen. This is how many people were actually exposed to your message. So, in general, that kind of stuff is very difficult on kind of the open podcasting. Whereas in China, users will pay directly for the content, whether it's, $100, 100 RMB for a course, whether it's like 1 RMB per audio file or something like that. And so, it's actually a lot easier to monetize and to kind of make a business off of Himalaya and Luzhi. That being said, we interviewed Rio Zhan, who is a early stage VC based in Shenzhen a couple of months ago, and he does 3 podcasts, and all 3 of those are on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, all in Chinese, which is interesting. I don't think he's making that much money from it. But then there is another podcast. A friend of mine runs a podcast called BB Park. It's all in Chinese. It's all for Chinese listeners. It's available on the open web, but they monetize in a kind of a KOL. A KOL method where they actually engage in e-commerce. They have meetups that they're able to monetize on, and they have a few other things that they do as well to monetize. But they're very unique because they've been podcasting since 2011, 2012, I think. And so really kind of first mover advantage, been around for a long time. And it's very talk radio-ish, I would say. And so, a lot of younger people who kind of grew up listening to radio, they enjoy listening to it. And it's young people who host it. And so they have a lot of really interesting personality. They're able to connect directly with their listeners and create that community. But they're, like I said, it's very unique what they're doing. Whereas in most cases, if you want to monetize, it has to be on Himalaya and Luzhi.
That's the thing, actually. In China, I feel that, I don't know if you feel the same, but the words are similar. We use the word blog in China and in the West. We use the word podcast in the West and in China. But actually, the real product at the end of the day is very different. Let's say a blog, for instance. I had a very hard time to explain to a Chinese CEO of a big firm that we're getting a lot of traction on blog at Asher Consulting. And he was saying, microblog? Weibo or Twitter, right? And he was not thinking about the long content, a long piece of article where we were going in depth. It was not in the mindset. And the ICP regulation, to get to the compulsory ICP you need to get to have your own website, are certainly slowed down or even killed this appetite for a very long article with your own platform. And now you go on platforms. You don't have your own website in China. That's the same, I believe, for podcasting. I'd like to talk about censorship. You are in a country where basically there is a censorship when you publish content, and you are publishing for the West. So in some way, you are a bit outside of the radar because you publish in English, but on the other hand, you are in China. Is it a concern for you? Is it a concern to comply with censorship regulations in China?
Well, this is funny because I just learned a new metaphor for something like this. China Tech Investor did an interview about blockchain, and I think that the interviewee, Matthew Graham, he made a really interesting metaphor. Basically, the anaconda in the chandelier, where there's an anaconda in the chandelier, and it's not really doing much, but you're in a room full of other people and you don't want to be the loudest person, right? You don't want to be the one to draw a lot of attention to yourself, because you never know when the anaconda might strike, choosing you because you're so obvious. So I think that's actually a really interesting way of kind of thinking about it. I mean, in general, we don't touch on sensitive issues, in part because sensitive issues are actually outside of our editorial purview. We focus on technology in China. We focus on telling people what's happening with Chinese companies. And certainly, we do ruffle the feathers of the companies themselves. There's been many conversations with companies of various types about our coverage of them, because that's journalism, right? We tell the truth as we see it, or as best as we can, about what's happening inside these companies, why they're making certain decisions, and what their prospects are, and so on and so on. So we definitely get a lot of pushback from the companies themselves. But I think to your point, I mean, we are China based. We are in English, so we are, I think, to a certain degree under the radar. But at the same time, like, we don't touch on sensitive issues. So, I worked at state media for about 5 years or so, and so I think my kind of sixth sense, if you will, is pretty well developed when it comes to this kind of stuff. So we basically stay away from all that stuff. And I think at the end of the day, it's not to our detriment either. Because again, we just want to understand what's happening, why it's happening. So we just want to tell people the way it is. And I do think that, I mean, there are some times, like, especially like with my weekly column that I write, when I do have a bit more freedom to kind of go in depth and have my opinion, there are some times, I think, where it does get a bit, It does kind of come close to some line, but at the end of the day, it's still factual. I'm not here to smear China. I'm not here to create, fear mongering or anything like that. At the end of the day, it's how can we best explain China to Westerners? And I think that there actually is a middle ground to all of this. A lot of people in the West, they want to see China as a boogeyman, as an enemy, but I don't think that China is. And I think that if you want to understand the world, you have to take a dispassionate point of view, and that's certainly what we try to do. So, a short answer to your question is that we cover tech. Tech is pretty neutral in general, and then when it does come to potentially sensitive issues, we try our best to avoid those.
I'd like to know a bit more about numbers, about how many metrics about TechNode and your podcast. Would you mind to share a little bit of the audience you have? Who is reading you? Who is listening to you? Which countries? How many people? If you can share some.
Yeah. So, so in 2018, we had about 4 million visitors to our website. 2019 is going to be more than that. When it comes to our podcast, we get about 7,000 to 8,000 downloads per episode for the China Tech Talk. China Tech Investor is much more niche, and so we get a little bit less than that. But then in terms of audience, the largest group of people that consume our content is from the United States. So consistently, we see the largest group is from the U.S., and then the second largest group is from mainland China, actually. But looking at kind of our analytics backend, we can see that most of the people coming from China are actually English speakers. So maybe they're European, maybe they're from the UK or from some other English-speaking country. And so so when I say mainland China, I don't mean Chinese readers. Most of them are going to be English speakers. And then I would say, so number 1 is US, number 2 is mainland China, 3 and 4 are Singapore and Hong Kong. Those kind of switch positions, and then number 5 is India. So we're very international in terms of our audience, but at the same time, the largest by far. I mean, on our website, for example, around 30% of our traffic comes from the United States, and that's the largest of any other demographic. And so definitely we can see that there's a huge amount of interest in China tech from specifically the United States. But then at the same time, we get some pretty decent numbers from elsewhere around the world, mostly in this region.
For the coming and last 15 minutes, I'd like to have your view on some topics which are coming over and over in China about tech. The first one is, from your opinion, why do so many foreign Western companies, tech companies, are failing? The one which I feel in China, the one it's a big subject. It could be 1 hour talk, I believe. But I believe you have your opinion already on it and some ideas. Microsoft have been successful, but it seems to be a bit of an exception. When you look at Uber failed, Google for some reasons failed in some way. Even if they do export advertising, they are selling ads for those Chinese companies, but they are not operating anymore in China. So you see a lot of those players failing in China, but there are different reasons. One is much more political and license with Google. One is purely business for Uber. So what's your take on that?
Well, I think that first of all, the China market is extremely difficult. I think that even you talk to domestic entrepreneurs, and they'll say the China market is extremely difficult. It's highly competitive, and you have to move fast, extremely fast. If you've thought about it for more than a day, you're probably moving too slowly. And I think so. I think that it's part of it's domestic, but also for foreign companies, there's a lot of issues around localization, and so there's localization of the product and there's localization of the team. So for example, I think Groupon is actually a really interesting example. So I'm not sure if you remember, Groupon came in around 2010, 2011, I think, and all of their top China management were American. So they flew Americans in and then tried to figure it out. And it's one of those things where the working culture is so different in China than it is in the West. So, the way that I think about it is that, China kind of lacks professional culture, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I don't mean that that there's something wrong with it necessarily, but Chinese people don't think of their jobs in kind of a professional way, right? Whereas I think that at least in America, my parents kind of trained me to think this way. My early bosses really kind of trained me to think this way of being conscientious, scheduling everything. Making sure that everything is delivered on time, that quality issues that issues are raised before delivery and things like that. Whereas in China, it's there's a very different relationship between manager and employee. The manager is kind of expected to be very hands-on, to kind of tell the employee exactly what to do and to give very extremely specific feedback. And so I think that as a Western manager, for me, that's been a bit difficult. But if you're, a Western tech company trying to come into the market and you don't find managers who know how to manage Chinese people, you're never going to get off the ground. It's the market, it's company culture, and then localization of the product as well. Localization of the product, localization of the marketing and advertising. I think that if you look at kind of the consumption landscape of China, people like games, they love discounts, and they love their celebrities. And so these days, of course, it's moving a lot more to kind of online celebrities. But also it used to be a lot of kind of traditional celebrities, Jay Zhou, for example, Wang Lihong, and so on and so on. And so I think that there's a whole suite of different things. But then also it's also government policy where it has been. I think they're trying to make it easier, actually, in the past couple of years with it's easier to get, a wholly foreign-owned enterprise license. But at the same time, it's still, you have to know the right people. You have to know the right people to get the license. You have to know the right people to help you open markets. So finding the right managers, finding the right partners, finding the right team on the ground, I think is all kind of what makes it so difficult.
You already answered partly to the question I'm going to ask, which is what are the common misconceptions about tech in China? But from an observer point of view, when you talk to people from overseas and we are following tech actually in the West and in China, what do you feel are the main misconceptions about what's happening in China in the tech industry? Do you find some pattern? I'm sure there are many. One of them being podcasting. It's the same word, but actually it's different in terms of practice. Blogging is the same word, but actually it's a very different way of doing it. But generally speaking, have you found some patterns, misconceptions on how to analyze the tech scene in China?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably the biggest one has, it was related to a podcast episode that we did recently on the social credit system. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that the government wants to be involved in everyone's life. I think that historically, if we look back to the founding of the People's Republic of China and kind of the evolution of the communist system here, I think that the government used to want to be very involved. But the success of kind of, this state-led capitalism system that we see now has been, in fact, a part of that story has been the story of the government slowly kind of receding from everyone's personal life. It used to be that the people that you worked with is the people that you married, the people that you lived with, and everything was very, very controlled on kind of a Danwei or business unit basis. These days, that doesn't happen anymore. And so, if we take a look at the social credit system, for example, number one, that system is actually more designed for private companies or companies. State-owned and non-state-owned. And then, over the last few years, there has been some more exploration of applying it to individuals. But a lot of it is still applying it to individuals in the context of, business malpractice, of not repaying your debts, of not replying or complying with court orders, and things related to, business malpractice. So did your company kill people, because you created a low quality product? Well, your social credit score is going to be affected. So no, I mean, like the government doesn't want to be involved in your life. I think that we are going to see probably more tracking of behavior, more analysis of behavior, but I think it's going to be very similar to tech companies, where at the end of the day, the government is much more interested in aggregate behavior. So are people following traffic laws? How are we enforcing those traffic laws? Are people following commercial laws? How are we enforcing those commercial laws? And so it has much less to do with today this person bought oatmeal. It's like why does the government care about that? They really don't. It's much more about kind of broader social management questions as well as broader economic management questions, which I think for a Westerner, for an American, who's raised to be very individualistic and to treasure freedom of speech and freedom of behavior, whatever that means, it's very difficult to kind of wrap your head around and to ultimately accept. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with it. I can kind of explain it a little bit as I did before, but it still feels weird. But just because it feels weird to me doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. It doesn't mean that it's 1984 Orwellian. I think that any technology is open to abuse, but at the same time, what China is trying to do with a lot of their technological kind of governance systems is really trying to solve age-old problems. There's a phrase in Chinese, the mountain is high and the emperor is far away. China has historically had amazing amounts of problems enforcing central government policies, and so this is, and even on a provincial level, and so this is just kind of one way to leverage technology to actually implement real kind of enforcement mechanisms, and actually to create more trust in society, as well as trust between individuals, trust between a customer and a company, but then also trust in the government, that the government is actually going to be enforcing laws and regulations.
True. Social credit, I think, is the example of misconception from the West and in China, and portraying it as something very new, very Orwellian, and it's not that new actually, to get a credit, companies and individuals. But yeah, that's very true. My last question is about actually your industry and yourself toward your peers. How do you stay up to date about China? How do you stay up to date about the news? You mentioned Weibo as a source of inspiration for Roundtable. I think it was when mentioning Roundtable. But now, what are the best sources you would recommend to use? Of course, TechNode and your podcast. But beyond that, what would you suggest to use to be up to date on China?
Well, I mean, I would say in English language, there's two main resources. One is Cynicism by Bill Bishop. So Bill Bishop has been a China watcher for many, many years, used to live in Beijing. And so he does a daily newsletter. It's basically, he aggregates and curates news stories about China, and that's one of the main ones that I read. And then there's another one called Sup China. Sup China is much more focused on culture, whereas Bill Bishop is much more focused on kind of politics and business, I would say. Sup China is very focused on culture, but both are very, very good resources for keeping up to date. You know, you spend 15, 20 minutes reading these newsletters every morning, and you'll pretty much know kind of what are the big trends, what are the big discussions going on, and things like that. In Chinese, I would say there's a few resources when it comes to tech. One is, I kind of hate saying it because they're also kind of our competitor, but there is, we have a Chinese version of our website, so cn.technode.com. So that's obviously a resource. Okay. But then apart from that, there's 36KR, so 36kr.com. So that's technology media. Ping West is also one. So in Chinese it's Pinwan, but their website is Ping West, Pingwest. And those are really kind of my main sources of when it comes to like tech news in Chinese. Huxiu is a good one for kind of longer form essays on, and it's usually not just tech, but it's also business. And then of course there's Tencent Tech, Sinatech, and kind of like the news aggregators where they have huge teams, but they don't actually do much original reporting. So I would say that those are my main sources of information about China.
Thanks very much for your time, John, for sharing. It was very, very instructive. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope everyone enjoyed. Thanks for listening. Thanks for participating.